Good morning, everybody. My name is Cody Norrid. I'm the Director of Programs and Policy with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Thank you for tuning in for our second installment of Coffee and Something Stronger, an interview show where we talk to different academics, practitioners, clergy about theology, environmental justice, climate change, and of course, the coronavirus. Joining me this morning is a good friend of Gipple and a good friend of mine, Reverend Hunt Priest, who is the clergy in charge at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Savannah and has been helping us with coastal work there, has hosted the Green Team Summit for us. And so excited to talk this morning with Hunt about all of the things that I mentioned and also how some of that work applies to the coast in particular. So Hunt, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, thanks, Cody. It's really an honor to be on here with you and to talk about these important matters. I've been in Savannah 3.5 years. We moved here from Seattle, where we lived for 8 years. We're native Southerners. My wife and I both are. We lived in Atlanta for 18 years before I went to seminary in my late 30s. I worked for Delta Airlines. I worked for an advertising agency in Atlanta. Went to seminary as a second or third career, and have been a priest for 15 years in the Episcopal Church. Went to seminary in Austin. Came back to Noonan, Georgia after ordination, and then went to Seattle for 8 years. And we've been here on Skidaway Island, where it's where the church is. I live on Isle of Hope, so right here in the marsh on the Georgia, incredibly beautiful Georgia coast. I'm so glad to be here. Love being in Seattle, and learned a lot about environmental justice, about environmental ministry. I was on the board of an environmental group out there called Earth Ministry, and Washington Interfaith Power and Light. So got introduced to the organization first in Atlanta and then out there, and then now back in Georgia, and really glad to have the connection again with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. So
well, thank you for coming on the show and for being here.
Cool.
I think you have a reading for us this morning that we'll open with and then dive into some conversation.
Yeah, I do. This is a poem by William Stafford, a poem that I came into my life at least 20 years ago, kind of part of my discernment about the priesthood and about ordination, and different times just comes up as a touchstone, I guess. So it's a ritual to read to each other by William Stafford. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as an elephant parade holding each other's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life gets lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Let me read that last stanza, because I think for me that's
Absolutely.
the gist of it. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep.
So good. So will you say a little bit about why you picked it and what it means to you and how you think it relates to this work?
Yeah, well, it's like I said, before I read it, it's definitely been a touchstone for me just at different periods of my life. I've used it in sermons. I've used it in my own discernment about the priesthood and about waking myself up or being awake to that. Something that I'd always sort of felt as even as a teenager and kept just wasn't the right time, but being awake to that voice inside me, calling me to this. And then each kind of transition of that, and then of my own ordained ministry, staying awake to what's going on in the world, what's going on in my local community of the congregation, or in Seattle or Atlanta or here in Savannah, being awake to the currents, being awake to the pain, being awake to the joy in myself and other people, and reminding other people to stay awake. I mean, I think that's certainly an important part of Christian spirituality and theology, to be awake to what God's doing in us, in the world, uh, in each of our lives. And so, yeah, I'm just reading it just now. I just was reminded of how it's so easy for us to go back to sleep, how easy for us to forget the darkness that's around us, and the light. That light, it's not just all darkness, but there's a lot of darkness. And if we can look for it, a lot of light that begins inside us. We are the light. We are the light of the world, as Jesus would say. So remembering that our individual and collective light shines in the darkness. And we have to be clear about what we say. Yes or no, or maybe. Maybe's okay too. It's as good as yes or no, but we have to be clear about what we think and what we believe and what we say, knowing that it can change. But and being open to what other people think and believe, even if we disagree with it. Even maybe especially when we disagree with it.
So what, I was going to ask this a little bit later, but I feel like I should just dive in now. What are you awake to now? You know, what's bubbling up for you, and what do you think that we should be awake to? What people in Georgia and Savannah should be awake to? That's pretty broad, but
yeah, I'll start with what I'm awake to, and then just keep me on track when I
sure.
Bring me back. Bring me back. Let me have one more sip of coffee. Nothing stronger, just coffee.
Yeah, not something stronger yet, just coffee.
It's strong coffee. That's what 8 years in Seattle will do. You got to have strong coffee, or don't even bother. I'm I'm awake to I'm awake to isolation. I'm awake to what it means, what other people have probably experienced a lot of, people that live by themselves, people that aren't a part of a community, not just a church community, but just part of community. I'm awake to what it means to not go out much in the world. And I go to the office at the church mostly when nobody else is there because it's closed. We're trying to be careful. But I'm aware of being alone a lot more than I was. My college-age son's home from school, so he's here, which has been a gift of this. And my wife and I are here, but I work in a room above the garage, so I'm up here by myself a lot on Zoom calls or reading, much more than I've ever been, probably ever, maybe by myself, because I've had a kind of a busy life, and the churches I've worked in have been busy, offices where people come and go, and I know that not everybody in the world has lived that way. So I'm aware of isolation, both the gift of it and the pain of it, and the ache of it, of wanting to be with other people. And so I'm really aware of isolation, and I'm aware of the beauty of where I live on the coast right now, because I go for walks or go for a run in my neighborhood. I'm paying attention to it. Savannah's had a beautiful spring. It's been almost cold some mornings, and not almost, it's been cold some mornings, which we don't have in May. And so I've been out and it's crisp, and I pay attention to that. I pay attention to what's blooming more than I have. I pay attention to people. I've noticed when I've been running or walking, people really are hungry for connection. And so they'll smile at me more, or I'll smile at them more than I probably have in the past. Even a friendly place like this,
Yeah.
I notice that people are aching for real connection. I'm noticing that some people are wearing masks and some people aren't. And I wonder what the political statement is about that. I wonder what the personal statement is, if there is one. I've noticed that I wear a mask mostly to say, I care about you. I don't think it makes much difference for me whether I wear a mask and
Mm.
because I'm getting what I'm getting. But I'm noticing that it's a signal. It's from that. I'm giving a signal to people that
Right.
I care about your health.
Right.
So I thought about that till just now. But it's a signal, and we give signals all the time to each other. And I think I'm maybe noticing the signals more.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you for that.
yeah,
Just want to transition a little bit to talk about maybe a framing would be how you've been awake to environmental work in your own journey, and maybe if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your work in Washington and our good friend in common, Leanne Barras, and our friendly organization partner there.
yeah,
So,
yeah. I did some thinking about this because I knew we would talk about this because it's a sort of formation as an environmentalist maybe, or a formation as a person who connects my care of the environment to my own Christian journey. And it goes back further than I probably realized until I started thinking about it. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, and in a town of 5,000 near Lexington, Kentucky, which is not in the mountains, but we weren't in the mountains, but we were close. So I could see the foothills of the Appalachians. They were probably 20 miles away, so I could see them. And I remember as a little kid looking out toward the east and just staring at the mountains, the foothills. It's really the more the foothills, the knobs, and spending a lot of time outside as a kid. Um, we had tobacco fields behind us, and we lived in town, but on the edge. And one of my grandmothers, my paternal grandmother, who was not, I hadn't thought about her being she never was outside, but she gave me a Rachel Carson book as a little kid that I have. It wasn't Silent Spring, but it was another book. Uh, and way too young to read it, but I still have it. And so she would walk us through our yard and tell us what the flowers were. And so that was there from an early age. Wendell Berry was somebody my family knew because people in Kentucky kind of know each other. And my mother had known him when they were younger. And so I knew about his work as always as a little kid. I knew there's a lake near us that a dammed lake for electricity that he had kind of fought to stop. And then the Red River Gorge was close, and he did lead a effort to stop the damming of the Red River, which would flooded that beautiful part of Kentucky landscape. Uh, and then I guess I forgot that sort of in my 20s and 30s. I just got busy with work and worked for Delta and uh, the airline industry. Although I love it so much about travel, is not an environmentally friendly industry, and I worked there for a long time, 10 years, and I miss travel. So I have such mixed feelings about all that and complicated relationships with all of it. And then, but it was when my son was 3, so he's 20 now. When he was 3 or 4, he got interested in a show about environmentalism as a little kid. He started watching it. And when we moved to Seattle, we stopped in Greenport, Kansas, because his place had been destroyed by a tornado, and he wanted to visit. He wasn't 3; he was 8 then. So we stopped there. He's smart, but he's not that smart. He was 8, but and he wanted to stop in Greenport because he'd seen a show about how they rebuilt it with environmental standards. And we stopped there for the rodeo. We just happened to stop on a rodeo parade day and met these people from there and visited these new green sites and the things they were doing with wind energy in this little town in Kansas. So he woke me up to it again, and then we moved to Seattle, which has a strong environmental consciousness. The Northwest does. And I was invited to, the founder of Earth Ministry had been the associate at Emmanuel Mercer Island, where I was the rector. And so I connected with Leanne and the people at Earth Ministry first. They asked me to be on the board, and Will, as he got older, became interested, and it was just part of our life. And the parish had a real connection. So it was both through the community, through my own history, through my own awakening consciousness, reawakening consciousness.
Yeah.
So that's
No, that's great.
Yeah, but it's a thread. It's a thread that I forgot about, and I woke back up to it.
Staying awake.
Staying awake, waking back up. Yeah.
What do you think? I'll ask two questions in one. One part is, you're an Episcopal priest. You've been in that work for a long time. Are there tools, traditions, frameworks that you think come out of that tradition that are particularly helpful for thinking about climate and environmental justice? And then also, because you did do some of that work in Washington, what has been the difference between the work going on in Washington and the work here? How is the landscape different? How is environmental work even within the parish different?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's that. Just make an eye signal if I just stop me when I speak. That's a great question. I think, and this is something I became aware of after I was ordained, maybe more than before, although my awareness goes back again to a little kid. I think the Episcopal Anglican tradition, with our roots in England and also with the strand of Celtic Christianity. I mean, English Christianity was always different, and it always had a mythological sensitivity, environmental nature sensitivity that never really, kind of the logical Western Christian sensibility, even the Protestant, it never got completely washed out. So Episcopal churches will often have beautiful landscaping. I mean, it's just, and you could say, well, that's just kind of the fanciness of the Episcopal Church. But I think it goes back deeper. I think it goes back to an English Celtic sensibility about the environment, about landscape. And so my other grandmother, my maternal grandmother, worked in the church I grew up in, one of the churches I grew up in, the Episcopal church in our town, it was in town next to the courthouse, but it had a beautiful prayer garden that was mostly the women of the church took care of in a really careful way. And my grandmother was one of those people. And my other grandmother had given a sundial to. So I had connections to that garden. And I remember my brother and I working with my other grandmother, moving, digging. And so every church I've been a part of, even Holy Comforter in Atlanta, which was a huge part of my own journey in East Atlanta, my own kind of waking up to my call to ordination, has a gardening program that's a huge part of their ministry. And so every Episcopal church that I've been a part of has taken great care for their grounds. And it's not just keeping up appearances, which you could say that's part of it, but that's not at all. I think there's this real awareness, even if it's not realized fully, of this care of creation that is part of the Episcopal Anglican history. And not to say that other traditions don't have it, but I think we have a strong sensitivity and a strong tradition of it that I think goes back to our English Celtic Christian roots.
Right. That's great. Yeah. And I know that I have not seen where you served in Washington, but I have seen your parish here, and that definitely tracks with all the Episcopal churches that we work with.
Right.
And so that's definitely something that stays the same, or probably is the same from those parishes. But what's different from doing it in Washington and doing it here, environmental work in the parish?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, I mean, the Northwest is just so, in some ways, not so far ahead of the rest of the country in ways. Not to say there's not major environmental issues there, but both the political and the spiritual climate is more oriented toward the outdoors. than sadly than we are in the Southeast generally, or in the East maybe in
Yeah.
general, not just the Southeast. And so it's in the Northwest. I think the culture pulled the church along, and in the Southeast, I think the church has responsibility to pull the culture along.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's harder because the church is not the dominant, even in the South, is not the dominant culture. The dominant culture in the South is the dominant American culture of consumption, of profit, of using resources until they're gone.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, which is to say in the Northwest it's that way too, but it's more dominant here,
Right.
and it's a much bigger uphill battle.
What do
Um,
you think are some of
there's
the?
much more
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, there's just more resistance to it here.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, what are some of the both, I guess, the unique challenges that I can imagine doing ministry on the coast has, and in Savannah particularly, but also, thinking about environmental justice and environmental issues. What do you see as what are the environmental justice issues in Savannah on the coast that you see and that people around you in your communities are dealing with?
Okay. Well, first, as you were talking, one thing about being on the coast is maybe another, as opposed to other parts of South Georgia or kind of non-metro Atlanta. One of the things that does make it easier on the coast is everybody loves what we live in. Everybody loves everybody and depends on the natural, beautiful environment. I mean, whether it's the whether it's the bounty of the ocean or the beauty of the marsh or the undisturbed islands, nobody wants that to go away. And that's why it was a probably easier battle on the coast to stop offshore drilling than it would be in other places, because it's still relatively undisturbed and people know that we depend on it,
Right.
economically depend on it. Uh, the, the challenges are not everybody has access to that, to the beauty of it, and not everybody benefits from the beauty of it. And lots of the beauty of the coast is inaccessible to a lot of people because you either have to get on a ferry or a private boat or through a gate, or and if you're not aware of that or don't have access to it, it's not as easy as a sail, I guess, to
Yeah.
say this is a if if you're not immersed in it. Um, and the farther out you go from the coast, even on the other side of 95, it's harder because it's just not as accessible, not as immediate.
So, given that context, what are some things you were kind enough to host the Green Team Summit, the Coastal Green Team Summit at St. Peter's last year? And I know that you have been in your own life and work doing some thinking about environment and creation care. And so, what are some things that you are doing yourself and maybe you're hoping that your congregation will do practically in the future on environment? And then maybe an addendum to that I'm sure that you could talk about for an hour and a half is, why do you think it's important to do this work from a theological perspective? What drives care for the environment and this sort of commitment to really take on climate change and environmental justice from a theological perspective? What should compel the church to do
Okay.
that?
Okay. That was a lot. Can we break it up?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the first?
So the first thing was if you could speak practically about some of the things that either you're doing or you're hoping that St. Peter's can do to engage in environmental work in Savannah.
Oh, that's okay. That's good. Uh, this does. I mean, St. Peter's is on Skidaway Island, which is only been developed in the last 40 or 50 years. 8,000 people live in the primary development, which is called the Landings, which when it was developed was very sensitive to the environmental beauty of, I mean, very sensitive to it. I mean, it's really developed, but it's also very environmentally sensitive, and I think people are there because they appreciate that and the natural beauty of it, and it's been maintained. Learning lessons from places that have done that earlier. So it's not a hard sell or a hard conversation to say this is important, we need to preserve it. I think the challenge I've seen here and in Seattle too was to help people make the connection between Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, spirituality, to make that connection.
Mm.
Because so much damage has been done theologically by using Genesis as a way to dominate, to extract, to say that creation is only here for our benefit, our economic benefit. That's a sin of kind of fairly modern Western Christianity. North American, European Christianity is to say that creation is for our economic benefit. And so to make it a theological, spiritual issue has been, that is a challenge, because people have not been taught that. People have been taught just the opposite.
Right.
And yet Scripture, so much of Scripture does not support that. It's been a political agenda, use of Scripture for a particular political agenda. And so when you try to reclaim it, Christianity as a environmentally aware, environmental care tradition, you get labeled as making it political.
Right.
When it's used by the other side or by the other viewpoint. So it's just, that's probably the biggest challenge, I think.
And so that kind of goes into the second part of the question that I wanted to ask you, which is for you, what are the ways that we can think about this better theologically? When you think about the link between theology and environment, where do you go? What's your ethic?
Well, I think to look at Genesis would be one. To look at the first chapter of Genesis as poetry, as God over and over saying it is, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good.
And saying that it's good a whole lot of times before human beings are mentioned.
Exactly. Yeah.
A lot of stuff is really good before we show up.
Wait for the party, right? And then in the second chapter of Genesis, the second creation story, we're in the garden, and it's humans. It's the human influence that makes it much more complicated, and the goodness begins to diminish, and going out of the garden, and into the wilderness and the harsh reality. So there's that. I think that's, start with there, because that Genesis story is, those two Genesis stories and how we interpret them make all the difference. How we've interpreted them make all the difference. And then I think to think about in the Gospels and in Jesus, how much of the ministry is outside, and Jesus in the both in the wilderness and in the landscape of Galilee and the desert of Judea. So little of Jesus's ministry is in the city, and it's mostly out in the open air, and on the water, and on the shore, and on the hilltops, and on the plain, and so much of it out in the world. It's an out in the world ministry.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think I have often thought about Jesus's ministry as a context for caring about the environment from the content, the basis where he sets his parables and stories, but I had not thought about the geographical location of the actual movements of the character of Jesus and where it's happening. Right. That's a really good one.
Right. Galilee is so much more important than Jerusalem. And Judea, the Judean wilderness, is so much more, it's maybe not more important, but so much more of the story happens out. I'm just thinking of the woman at the well. That's outside. It's so much of it is outside.
Yeah, not a lot's happening inside.
No, it'd be interesting to sort of see how many of those stories are. Very few are inside a house,
Right.
and in some ways, the hardest parts are inside a house or a building. So, um,
I want to take us,
yeah, and the garden and the rest of it's not insignificant at all. It's probably critical that it's in the garden. Well, it's in the garden before the crucifixion, and in a garden after the crucifixion, where the resurrected Christ is fully seen. It's out in the garden.
yeah,
That's huge.
it's
It's
all
huge.
happening in the context of
Yeah.
creation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, I, Michael Malcolm, who is a dear friend of mine who runs Alabama IPL, often says this, and people say this a lot, that um, there can be no work on climate without justice. That you can't work on climate change without doing environmental justice work. And so I do want to take us
Right.
a bit towards justice. And I know that that is
Right.
something that you have worked on a lot. And so first I'll start by just asking, could you tell us a little bit about the justice work that you're doing in Savannah with your interfaith clergy group and
Okay.
what kind of priorities has come out of that? Obviously, we were talking about this before we came on, that some of that, the challenges of activism in a coronavirus world are
Right.
there and can stall some things, but tell us a bit about that.
Okay. So I've been in Savannah 3.5 years, and I'm out from St. Peter's is out from town a little, maybe I don't know, 12 miles or something, and just geographically a little isolated from the rest of the city, but close enough. And people that live there in the landings and they go and elsewhere they go to St. Peter's are here because the city's close, and lots of people at St. Peter's serve both financially and with their time and talent underserved communities, uh, poor communities, the Black community, finding ways to in education especially. So there's that in the congregation already. But one of the things I was aware of as a uh, leader of a congregation is I didn't have relationships beyond sort of the Episcopal, and I have good relationships in the Episcopal world here, but across racial lines, across other denominations or religious traditions, I didn't have that. And I realized that lots of people felt that way, that a lot of the clergy didn't have relationships beyond their own little, at least the white clergy. I don't know so much about it. I don't know. So I didn't, and I'll speak to that. And about a year and a half ago, there was a group that began to form a community organizing group that's related to DART, which is a nationwide community organizing consortium or group that has groups in Charleston and Jacksonville and Tampa, Louisville, Kentucky, Lexington, Knoxville, uh, that bring congregations together across racial, denominational, even religious traditions together to find common ground. Just sort of basic community organizing that happens in other places, uh, congregational based community organizing. And so it's just getting started here. Savannah has never had that uh, sort of work done. And the relationships across those barriers are already now strong. We've just hired a local community organizer, incredibly gifted young woman who's about to graduate from the College of Charleston, African American woman who's from Spartanburg, moving here, which we're all so excited about, which seems kind of crazy to be doing that in the middle of, well, it's both a health emergency and an economic emergency. But the board decided that this was the time to take the chance and to make the commitment, because we need those relationships if we're going to build and rebuild our community.
And the
Unfortunately.
work is challenging, even more so challenging in a
Right, right,
virus world,
right.
but it becomes so clear that those injustices are exacerbated even more in this
Oh,
version of the world that we have now, and that the work has to continue in
oh yeah,
some way, that we have to figure out ways to keep doing that work because
right.
the injustices haven't stopped. If anything, they've gotten worse.
Right, right. Well, we're more aware of them, and the pain is the pain. I guess the injustices haven't gotten worse. Just the pain has gotten worse, and the awareness has gotten higher in the last 2 months. Well, I don't know. Yeah, and it's gotten worse because access to healthcare
Right.
and money and yeah. So yeah, it's gotten worse.
We've
And
talked about
we're aware of it.
environmental work or environmental frameworks from theologically, and primarily from how the texts and the traditions talk about the environment itself: creation, trees, rocks, the ground,
Right,
gardens,
right.
the glory of creation. I wonder if one of the ways that we talk about it here at Gipple, and then I talk about it, is to also from the lens of care for neighbor. And I'm curious, since you're so steeped in some of this work happening in Savannah, and we were even talking about sort of the struggle of community now when
Right.
everyone is separate and not being able to have that at St. Peter's, and just generally, we don't have community. It's hard to stay tethered. And so I wonder if you could talk about environmental work from a care for neighbor perspective.
Yeah, so that's because that's really key to the whole concept of community organizing is that it's in those one-on-one relationships and then the kind of smaller group to smaller group and then congregation to congregation, but it's in those core relationships where all the work gets done, so that I become more and more aware of the economic injustice, the environmental injustice of my neighbor on the other side of town, whether he or she be Black or Latino or white, that what they're going through, I become more aware because I have more of a relationship, a deeper relationship. So it's the deeper relationships that's hard work, that can make us uncomfortable, that we have to confront our own biases, our own prejudice, our own racism, our own classism, our own assumptions. We have to come face to face with that. But only in that are we ever going to get to the real solutions to all the problems that we all know. I think sometimes we just throw up our hands. We all know they're there because we see them on the news or we see them when we drive past something or some person, but only in the relationships. And I think the people that have done the work, for example, at St. Peter's in the schools with kids, helping them learn to read or whatever, see through their relationships the struggles that families have.
Yeah.
And only then, otherwise, it's just a cardboard cutout of a person.
Right.
It's on the news and that we somehow become afraid of because we don't know them. And what happened in Brunswick, what's happening in Brunswick right now is it's all of those things in a microcosm of lack of relationship, lack of understanding what it means to be Black in this country, a Black young man especially, but Black in general, or Latino, or different in some way. We're once again seeing it, and we see our own failures, how we fail our neighbors by not taking seriously their pain and suffering, being awake to their pain and suffering.
I was going to bring us back to being awake, since
Right.
that seems to be the theme of our conversation,
Right.
and to say, what are the ways that you in your own life, but also how you minister, and what are the ways that we as individuals and as congregations can stay awake? How do we stay awake? What do we do to ensure that we're trying to stay awake, both so that some of the justice issues that you're thinking about, environmental justice, but then also even just creation, to be awake to see it and
Yeah.
not just use it or commodify it?
I that's oh god, that's really helpful. Because I'm not sure I've thought about this like that. But uh, for me, I think I have to remember what I use, how I put myself to sleep, how I check out, how I ease my pain, ease the pain of living, and it's not so bad. I mean, I'm not saying we have to be like 100% woke all the time, but I think we numb ourselves out with screens. I think we numb ourselves out. Different times in my life, I've numbed myself out with reading or watching TV, kind of mindless junk food. Um, and so, first of all, I have to remember how I put myself to sleep or let myself go to sleep, and then find ways to not do that. Always, I think Scripture can certainly, for Christians, for religious people, uh, Scripture, the stories of Scripture, Jesus wakes us up every time. Every time we encounter Jesus, I feel like there's a gentle shake of pay attention to this, pay attention to uh, the suffering of others, pay attention to your own suffering. Maybe first, pay attention to your own suffering. Where's the pain in my life? Because that's what we numb, really. Maybe is the pain in our own life. Uh, just being a just be it's sort of answering no.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a bit, it feels very meditation, very
And so
mystic,
yeah,
because sort of just saying to stay awake
right,
seems to be part of that, thinking
right,
that, being in that mindset.
right. And my meditation practice wakes me up. That seems in some ways counterintuitive, that if you're but if I'm, I tried at 20 minutes at least every morning, and I try in the afternoon, but I'm really pretty good about the morning, and 20 or 25 minutes. And when I drift off, I'll notice something about my body. I'll notice something that hurts or bothers me, or I'll notice what I drift my thoughts to. And that's in some ways putting me to sleep to what's going on inside me.
Mm.
It's hard to explain.
That's kind of a nice framing too, even I think in an environmental context, to sort of work to stay awake, to see what's hurting and what's hiding under the surface, or what people are attempting to hide about it.
Yeah.
And trying to allow creation to speak for itself and be attentive to that, I think is definitely relates to that.
Here's something that woke me up. Somebody else did. In some ways, a small gesture that woke me up that I'm not aware of now, because I don't go to work. I don't leave the house to go to work at 8:45 or every morning like I used to. There's a couple that walks up and down Ferguson, which is a straight shot road in Savannah that takes me to work. And it's lined with live oaks. And there's a couple every Tuesday, I think, that walks up Ferguson picking up garbage every Tuesday. And that me seeing them do that just reminds me of, in some ways, it's small things, but persistent small things that make a difference.
Environmental work is much like a spiritual discipline. I think about, often you can make the case about the hassles and the complications of something like recycling or composting, but those spiritual disciplines, the paying attention to it, the being reminded of it, it forces you to think about it all the time. Those small actions seem to be incredibly important.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
we could talk forever. I have two questions that I'll end with, that I'm going to be asking every guest that comes on Coffee and Something Stronger right now. The first one is, well, I'll ask them together and you can decide how you want to answer them. What are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world? And what are you clinging to that gives you hope in the midst of it?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I really am. I'm missing being in rooms of people, and that not just church on Sunday. That's part of it. That's a big part of it. But I'm just missing being around groups of people, because of the energy, I think, that's generated when we all get to. There's something that happens when groups of people are together, regardless of what we're doing. That that energizes me. I'm an introvert, so too much of that sends me running. But I'm really aware of how much I miss being in rooms of people. Uh, and what gives me hope is that people are finding ways at St. Peter's, other things I'm a part of, finding ways to be together, even if it's not the most satisfying, which is to be on things like a Zoom call,
Right.
or to sit in a wide circle and just talk, keeping your physical distance. But mostly I'm on a lot of Zoom calls, and as exhausting as they can be, they're also giving me hope. People at St. Peter's are showing up on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock
Mm.
for a Zoom call and staying for coffee hour in small groups and showing up for workshops on Zoom. And maybe I don't know how long that's going to last. Maybe, I don't know, but for now it gives me huge hope that we're still finding ways to connect to each other.
Hunt, thank you so much for coming on and just talking about your life and your journey. Everybody, we will be back next Tuesday at 10 for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. You can also find the recordings on our website. I'm going to close us out with a reading from Psalms of the Earth, which is a book that we use a lot here at Gipple by Dorothy Darr. And then we'll see you next week. It begins, "My joy is in the grace of the Lord who made heaven and earth, who gave us the spring and the summer, the water and the tides, the sea and the sky. Thanks be to God and God's creations. Thanks be to the world and all of its creatures. Thanks for our faith and our love, our favor and our future, for we walk here on God's good earth for a purpose. We are here among human beings as messengers of God's goodness and mercy. May we live in love and peace among all living creatures and sing joy to God's grace each day. Amen."
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and do whatever you can to stay awake to each other and to your neighbors and to creation. And we'll see you next week.